All right, that thing's rolling, and there, that's for sound. All right. Well, God bless you all. Good to see everybody here. Not like we didn't just open this and now we're redoing it, but good to see everybody here. This will be lecture number 3 in our course, A General Introduction to the Bible. And remember, the course is intended to help people who've never really opened the Bible before understand what the Bible is, how it works, and even those of us who have been reading the Bible for some time, this course is meant to help us maybe better explain the Bible to people. So that's really the point of the course. And it's really nice to see everybody here. Okay, so here we go. This is just sort of an aid to the memory. But remember that we're working off of Max Anders' fine book, 30 Days to Understanding the Bible. And he has 2, I think maybe now 3 editions of the book. And although we've adapted it somewhat, I've added some things, I've used different verses than he uses sometimes. But the basic structure of the course is modeled after Max Anders' 30 Days to Understanding the Bible. So we really do want to give credit where credit is due. And some of the visuals that you'll see throughout the course are right from Max Anders' books. So here we go. This is a basic structure of the Bible. The Bible, of course, is broken down into 2 parts. One really big part we call the Old Testament, and the littler part we call the New Testament. The Old Testament is made up of 39 books, individual books, a little library from God. And remember last time we saw that the Old Testament is broken down into historical books, poetical books, and finally prophetical books. And in your English Bibles, your English translations, they're conveniently already sectioned off that way. So the first big batch of books are historical. They give you historical narrative. The second batch of books are poetry, and then comes prophetical books, okay? In the New Testament, these are the books that document for us the life of Jesus, his earthly ministry, and the church that he founded. The New Testament also broken down into 3 major sections. Historical books of the New Testament, then letters from the Apostle Paul, and then other letters. So again, three sections in the Old Testament, 3 sections in the New Testament. The Old Testament, the history covered there goes all the way back 6,000 years ago, or 4,000 BC, although the first book of the Old Testament wasn't written until about 1400 BC, or 3,400 years ago, and that's Moses. He gives us the book of Genesis, right? First book of the Bible. New Testament covers a historical period of about 2 BC when Jesus was born to about AD 95 when the book of Revelation is completed. Okay, and that only covers like a single century, whereas the Old Testament covers a much broader historical spectrum, right? So lastly, remember we did look at some Bible geography, and all of the action in the Bible takes place in the Middle East. Okay, and when you get to the book of Acts, it expands a bit. It goes out into Europe, maybe as far as Spain. But most of the action takes place in an area in the Middle East that's about the size of the state of Texas. And we're going to talk more about this as the course goes on. But Old Testament history, it all takes place either in Israel. Some of Old Testament history is there in Egypt. Some in Babylon. You can see there's the Mediterranean Sea here. There's Cyprus there. When we get into the New Testament, the picture broadens quite a bit. There's Cyprus there. Now it's just a little bitty thing on this map. But the Apostle Paul takes the gospel all the way through Asia Minor into Europe. He goes all the way to Rome. He probably made it to Spain. So much broader geographical area there in the New Testament. Okay? And that's where we left off last time. Now we want to keep going here, and we want to think about Bible history. Okay? So much of the Bible is history. It's God's divine acts in the world. Okay? It's God has done things in the world. God has touched the planet. He's touched people. He's done things. And the Bible documents all that for us. Okay? And now the way to keep all this straight is to just is to think about historical eras. I used to say eras, And then our British friend reminded me that an era was a mistake. I was talking about the eras of the Bible. He said, there are no eras in the Bible. Eras. I said, maybe we're living in an era of great era. Maybe, I don't know. But this comes out of Max Anders' book. It's a visual straight out of the book. I could have used Canadian history, but I'm just painting by the numbers here. And so he has a timeline of early U.S. history. Notice here he's got the eras. The colonial period is one era. Then you got the Revolutionary War, the next era in American history, the federal period, the Civil War, and so on. And notice that for each era, you have a key figure. You have somebody who's center stage in that era. Okay? And you also have a key location as well. So what Max Anders does, he gives it to you in chart form, makes it very, very easy to understand, visually pretty clear. In U.S. history, you have the colonial era. The key figure is Ben Franklin. The key location is Boston. And then he has a brief synopsis, a brief storyline. And for Ben Franklin, it goes like this. As the 13 colonies long for independence, Franklin leads in the formulation of necessary strategy. And then he goes on, next era is revolution. Thomas Jefferson's the key figure. Philadelphia is the key location. And then as a storyline, he says, Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence. So you can see, if you're trying to learn about U.S. history, key eras, key figures within each era, a key location, and a brief synopsis. We're going to do that in this course with both the Old and the New Testaments. And I'm thinking for tonight, we have 2 lectures tonight. I really apologize if it seems a bit tedious, but please stay with the course. It's going to get very much more colorful and more interesting. And nobody get overwhelmed by the amount of data that you're going to be introduced to, because what Max Anders does and what we will do, we will look at some information, and then we'll look at it again, and we'll give a little more detail, and then we'll look at that same information again. And so don't think that you have to memorize everything the first time you see it. That's one of the great strengths of Max Anders' approach. He gives you the information, and he keeps reviewing it with you. And then he adds a little something, and by the time he's done with you, you really do understand the Bible. Okay? So let's just, we'll briefly introduce the arc of Bible history as Max Anders gives it to you in his book. He says the first era that's mentioned in the Old Testament is the creation era. This is when God created the world and early events that happened. We'll say all the way up to the flood and a little bit after the flood. Okay, that's the creation era. The next era is the patriarchal era, where God calls Abraham to be the father of a brand new people group, the Hebrew people. The next era is Exodus. Remember, God's people wound up in Egypt, in slavery, and Moses was the guy to get them out. That's the Exodus era. The next one, conquest. After they came out of Egypt, God chose Joshua to lead the conquest of the Promised Land. After they got into the Promised Land, the next era was the era of the judges. Israel at that time didn't have a king, and so she was ruled by a succession of judges. The judges era ends, and the kingdom era begins. Finally, Israel did have a king. And after a succession of mostly unrighteous kings, Israel was led into exile in Babylon. That's the next era, exile. Then they returned after 70 years to rebuild the temple. And after their return, there's a silence period between the testaments. Okay? I'll just mention all these visuals that you see throughout the course, all the notes that you see, all the text that you see. I put them all on the website in PDF form, so you don't have to write down feverishly. At your convenience, you can download the PDF files, okay? So this is the Old Testament here, given to you in pictorial form. Creation, patriarch. You've got Exodus, conquest, judges, kings, exile, return, a silence period of 400 years between the Old and the New Testaments. That's where the split comes right there. And then after the silence period, Jesus comes. You've got Gospels, the church era, and then missions. And that's basically how the Bible's broken down into its various eras. They can call these eras. Some are long, some are short in terms of time. But if you're going to know the Bible, you need to become very, very familiar with Israel's history. The Bible is really a history of Israel. God's chosen people. They're the people God chose to bless the world. And they blessed the world primarily because Jesus was born into that nation. That's the main thing. You read Romans chapter 9. Jesus was born a Jew. And he's still a Jew. He's still the Lion of the tribe of Judah. So to understand God's action in the world, to understand the Bible correctly, you've really got to become familiar with this arc of Bible history. It's all about God's action in the world, okay? So, in summary fashion, here are the 9 main eras of Bible history in the Old Testament, okay? We'll look at them again now, and we give a very brief synopsis of each era. Number 1, the creation era, the creation of the world and man and early events. Next comes the patriarch era, and that is the birth of the Hebrew people through a family of patriarchs covering a period of about 200 years, and that begins with Abraham. And we're going to keep revisiting this. We're going to go through all 9 eras, and we're going to revisit this, and we're going to expand upon some things. But by the time we're done, you're going to know that arc of Bible history, okay? After the patriarch era comes the Exodus era. The Exodus of the Hebrew people as they are delivered out of slavery, 400 years of slavery in Egypt. Conquest follows Exodus, the conquest of the promised land by the Hebrew people upon their return from Egypt. Followed by the Judges era, a 400 year period during which Israel is governed by rulers called judges. Then comes the kingdom, an additional 400-year period during which Israel becomes a full-fledged nation ruled by a monarchy. Of course, most of those kings were unrighteous, and Israel was taken into captivity, into exile, into Babylon. And that's number 7, period number 7, or era 7, a 70-year period during which Israel's leaders live in exile, having been conquered by foreign countries. First Assyria, then Babylon. Return, they were allowed under the Persian king, the ruler there, Cyrus the Great, go back and build your temple. So they returned, the return of the exiled Jews to Jerusalem to rebuild the city and the temple. And then the silence, 400-year silence there between the testaments after the close of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. So again, in chart form, there's our 9 eras or periods: creation, patriarch, Exodus, conquest, judges, kingdom, exile, return, silence. We have some key figures that are associated with each era. 1 key figure per era, a location where the action takes place, and a brief storyline. Okay? So once again, there it is in pictorial form for you. Okay? Creation, patriarch, Exodus, conquest, judges, kings, exile, return, silence, New Testament, Gospels, church, missions. And there you have it. Can anyone recite the first one? What's that first era? Creation. Next one? Patriarch. Exodus. Conquest. Judges. Kings. Exile. Return, silence between the testaments. Very good. Oh, you guys are awesome. Do we need this course? We're trusting somebody needs this course, right? Okay, so here we go. Here's our 9 eras in the Old Testament. And here's our central figures here. The central figure of the creation era is, of course, Adam. Adam is the first man. And, of course, the Bible treats Adam like a real person, not just a mental abstraction, not some kind of fairy tale figure, a made up thing. he's not treated as a parable or something. He's a real somebody. He's our father, kind of, right? Genetically, physically, Adam is the progenitor of the human race. So the creation era has a central figure, and that's Adam. The patriarch era has a central figure, and his name is Abraham. Abraham lived 4,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, and God called that man. He said, "Go, get out of your father's house, go to the land I will show you." And he becomes the father of the nation of Israel. So he's the first patriarch. He's the father of that special people group. Exodus, our man is Moses. Yeah, he's God's chosen man to lead the Exodus and to give the law to the people of Israel. Then we have the conquest era, and our man there is Joshua. Joshua leads the conquest of the Promised Land. The Judges era, our central figure there is, it's hard to know, Max Anders has Samson. Samson is the central figure. I guess because he's the most well-known judge. We think about Samson and his fantastic strength and pulls down the temple down upon the Philistines and so on. I kind of like Gideon, but whatever. I like Gideon. Okay, but Judges, we have a central figure. Max Anders says Samson. He's the most famous judge. After the Judges period ends, Israel is then ruled by a succession of kings. So that's the kingdom era, and the most important of the kings is David. David's our central figure. God made many promises, you'll see in the Old Testament, to David and his dynasty. He said, the house of David will not lack a man to sit on the throne. And of course, in the New Testament, Jesus Christ is born into the lineage of David. And in fact, it tells us in the beginning of Luke's gospel that when Jesus returns, he'll actually sit on the throne of his father David. He is a Davidic king. So that's very wonderful. Well, the kingdom era ends sort of tragically because mostly unrighteous kings ruling in Israel. It ends in exile. The people of Israel are taken captive by Babylon, and they're 70 years in Babylon. And the central figure during the exile period is Daniel. Remember Daniel? He's taken probably around 605 BC to Babylon, and he ministers there in the king's court. But he is absolutely uncompromising in his commitment to God, the true God. And he has given spectacular prophecies concerning the future. So Daniel is our key figure in the exile period. Then comes the return. After the 70 years had expired, God allowed his people to return from exile back to Jerusalem to build their temple around 516 BC. And our key figure here is Ezra the scribe. Ezra, you'll see, he's he's the progenitor of the rabbinic tradition. Today we have rabbis in synagogues. And Ezra is kind of the first one. He kind of sets the stage. He brings the people back, and he stands up on the raised platform, and he delivers the law to the people. Ezra the scribe. He's kind of our central figure there. Ezra and Nehemiah, it's kind of hard to choose which guy, but Ezra is the one that Max Anders chooses as the central figure. And then finally, during the silence era between the Testaments, we have the Pharisees. And we're familiar with these guys, right? They are the people of the book. They're the religious leaders. And they're enjoying places of high prominence in the time of Jesus, remember? They're very righteous, self-righteous, in fact, and committed to the law and all the rabbinic accretions that have built up around the law. They were very big on that. And Jesus had to correct those guys too, didn't he? So there's our key figures there. There's the eras and the key figures. Adam, the first man. Abraham, the first patriarch. Moses, the leader of the Exodus. Joshua, the leader of Israel's army. Samson, the most famous judge. David, the most well-known Israelite king. Daniel, a major exilic prophet. Ezra, the central return leader from exile. And finally, the Pharisees are the religious leaders, the people of the book. So, really important that we got these eras in our mind, set them in concrete in the right order, and have it in our heads who is the central figure of each era. Once you've got that settled, you are a long way towards really understanding the Bible. And this helped me tremendously, okay? So here, again, in chart form, here's our eras, our 9 eras of the Old Testament. And there's the central figure for each era. And we're now going to supply location and storyline. So here's our era number 1. What do we call this era, folks? Creation. Central figure? Adam. Location? Eden. The Garden of Eden. Now, Max Anders says the Garden of Eden, where Adam is created, is near the convergence of the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, which I highly doubt. Right? And we talked about that last time. I don't think anyone knows where Eden really, really is. Okay, second era is patriarch, central figure, Abraham. And he is going to travel to Canaan, which later becomes labeled Israel, the land of Israel. Abraham migrates from Ur near Eden to Canaan, where he and the other patriarchs live until the time of slavery in Egypt. That's sort of our description of what's happening there. Third era, Exodus. Moses, the figure, in Egypt. A lot of the action takes place in Egypt. During a severe famine, the Israelites migrate to Egypt and are enslaved 400 years before their exodus to freedom. So if we were to look at a map here, again, Max Anders has Eden somewhere around here because of these 2 rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Tigris and Euphrates are mentioned in Genesis 2 as being in proximity to Eden. And I just kind of think the flood would have rearranged the whole world, and ancient people on this side of the flood would just start naming things, name rivers that remind you of pre-flood geographical locations. So I don't really think these are the actual rivers that existed before the flood. That's my opinion, and that's okay if you disagree. But now, Abraham is called out of Mesopotamia. He takes this arc here in his travels up to Haran and then down into this area here, became known as the land of Israel. But in Abraham's time, it's called Canaan. Okay. And then there was a severe famine, and the Israelite people, 70 of them, migrated to Egypt. And they're in Egypt, and they became slaves. In a few generations, the Pharaoh that rose to power put all of Israel in slavery. 400 years in slavery, and Moses led them out, and Joshua led the conquest of this promised land here, you see. And that's our next era. The next era is conquest. Joshua is our figure. Canaan. Joshua leads the conquest of the promised land in Canaan. Okay. What's our next era? Judges, you got it. Judges, the next era. Samson, the most famous judge. Again, we're in the land of Canaan here. The Israelites live in Canaan under a loose tribal system ruled by judges for the next 400 years. That's how they lived. Okay. Then comes kings. David is our central figure. With the formation of a new formal monarchy, the land is now referred to by the national name Israel. And again, all the action takes place here. There's Jerusalem, the Dead Sea, Sea of Galilee up here, where Jesus would be born, or Jesus born basically in Bethlehem, but raised in Nazareth up here by the Sea of Galilee. Jordan River there, where Jesus would be baptized later on. But Old Testament history now in the kingdom period all takes place in the land of Israel. Okay. Well, after the kingdom era comes exile, mostly unrighteous kings. So you've got exile, our figure, Daniel the prophet in Babylon. Okay, because of judgment for national moral corruption, Israel is conquered by foreign nations, finally forcing her leaders into 70 years of exile in Babylonia. And then, what happened? They returned. Return era, central figure, Ezra is our guy, Ezra the scribe. The exiled Israelites are allowed to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the city and the temple, though they remain under the domination of Persia. Right? It was Cyrus who said, go back, build your temple, not because Cyrus was such a great guy, but because he wanted all the nations to go pray to their gods for him, right? Why should it not go well for the king and his sons, he said. Sure. So in a very selfless manner, he sent the Israelites back. And I'm kidding. Okay. After the return comes silence. Who's our people? The Pharisees. You bet. Though dominion of the land changes from Persia to Greece to Rome, Israel is allowed to worship in Jerusalem without disruption for the next 400 years of silence. So again, Joshua, he leads the conquest of the Promised Land. In the Promised Land, you have judges first ruling, then kings under God, and David, the most famous king. Because most of the kings were unrighteous, God judged Israel, sent them to Babylonia, way over here where Abraham was called, basically. 70 years in Babylon, being ministered to by Daniel the prophet. After 70 years, they were allowed to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. And under Nehemiah, the walls were rebuilt. And there they stayed. And even though the pagan world-dominating power changed from Persia to Greece to Rome, Israel remained in her land. She was given a measure of autonomy. She could still worship at the temple. She could still observe her religious rituals as prescribed in the Bible. And that leads us into the 400-year silence period there between the Testaments, okay? So there's your, in chart form, your 9 eras: creation, patriarch, Exodus, conquest, judges, kingdom, exile, return, silence, the corresponding central figures, and the central locations where these things take place. You notice that geographically, there's not a whole lot of territory there that's talked about in the Old Testament, right? Remember, about the size of the state of Texas. Most Bibles have maps in them. If you get a good Bible, it'll have maps in it. Consult your maps. It's very, very helpful sometimes, So, is that clear to everybody, kind of, sort of? And we're going to just keep revisiting this, and we're going to keep adding a little more detail each time until it's pretty solid in everyone's mind, okay? Let's just quickly look at some storyline summaries, and then we'll close out this lecture, okay? So here's our storyline summaries. The creation era, central figure Adam, location is Eden. And here's a storyline summary or a synopsis of what happened. Adam is created by God, but he sins and destroys God's original plan for mankind. That's the central theme of the creation era. Under the patriarch era, Abraham is chosen by God to father a people to represent God to the world. And we know that people to be who? Did someone say Inuit? Israel, thank you. Okay. Under the Exodus era, the storyline goes like this. Through Moses, God delivers the Hebrew people from slavery in Egypt and then delivers them the law, gives them the law. And we talked about the law this morning, didn't we? Conquest era. Joshua leads the conquest of the Promised Land, the land of Canaan, which became the land of Israel. Under the Judges era, Samson and others were chosen as judges to govern the people for 400 rebellious years. Note that. We're going to revisit that. After the Judges period comes kingdom. David, the greatest king in the new monarchy, is followed by a succession of mostly unrighteous kings, and God eventually judges Israel for her sin, sending her into exile. Next era, the exilic period. Daniel, the prophet. Daniel gives leadership and encourages faithfulness among the exiles for the next 70 years. And again, when 70 years had expired, Israel was allowed to return to her homeland, build her temple, begin the sacrificial system up again. And so our synopsis sounds like this. Ezra leads the people back from exile to rebuild Jerusalem. And in fact, first the temple and then Jerusalem. Followed by the silence period. 400 years. The Pharisees and others entomb the Israelites in legalism for the next 400 years. And that's between the Testaments, okay? So any questions on anything that we looked at so far? We did that pretty quick, but again, we're going to be revisiting this and reviewing this so that you really understand. But anyone have any questions or comments about anything that we just looked at? Does it make sense to everybody? Is this new to anybody? Tell me it was a good review at least. Very good review. Okay, awesome. Okay, so with that, we'll close out this lecture. We'll take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll do our fourth lecture in this series, okay? Okay, let's do that.